They said I should feel grateful to be alive at 79, but gratitude is a strange thing to demand from a woman who has just watched her only son being handcuffed beside her birthday cake. And stranger still, when I remember the first words he whispered the day everything truly began to fall apart. "Mom, donate to my charity. You trust me, right?" He said it so gently that guilt moved through me like warm water, dissolving my hesitation before I could even name it. I remember the look in his eyes, steady, practiced, and bright enough to pass for conviction, but shallow in a way that I only recognize now, after the damage had matured into something permanent. I didn't know then that he had rehearsed it, that every tilt of his head, every soft note in his voice, every mention of the children we're helping was a line in a play I hadn't agreed to join. I only knew that my son, my boy with the soft hair I used to brush after baths, my boy who once cried when he lost a school art contest, was asking me to believe in him. And because I am a mother, and because mothers are the easiest people in the world to deceive, I believed. I live alone now, in a house smaller than the one where I raised him, a house where my footsteps echo the way my presence once echoed through his life. It's not much, a narrow kitchen, a sagging armchair, the same kettle his father and I bought when we had more optimism than money, but it's quiet, and at this age, quiet is more precious than anything that sparkles. I used to fill silence with excuses for him. He's busy, he's stressed, he's rebuilding, he's trying. I thought that if I stayed patient, if I stayed generous, if I stayed soft, motherhood would eventually be reciprocated. But softness in older women is a commodity people mistake for weakness, and I spent too long allowing others to make that mistake. My son didn't always speak to me the way he did that day, in the voice of someone who already knew he would win. When he was small, he asked instead of instructed. He stood close instead of hovering at a distance. He brought me wilted wildflowers and mismatched drawings of us holding hands. I raised him on casseroles and late-night talks and hand-me-down wisdom from women who taught me that family is a thread that should never be cut, not even when it frays. I didn't expect that one day he would be the one holding scissors. When he first told me about his charity, I was sitting at my kitchen table folding laundry, the kind of slow, thoughtful folding that older hands do without hurry. He sat across from me with that professional, curated air that appears like a second skin on people who fear being ordinary. He wore a suit too expensive for a man whose bank account had always been an unreliable creature, and he held a brochure printed on glossy paper, bright and hopeful, adorned with photos of children he said he and his team were helping escape addiction and homelessness. He spoke of hope and second chances, and a vision that felt noble enough to drown out the faint but insistent tug of doubt in my chest. Maybe it was the way he leaned forward, lowering his voice as if inviting me into something sacred. Maybe it was the word "mom," said with the softness of a boy who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares. Or maybe it was just loneliness, the loneliness that gathers on the bones of older women like dust, settling quietly until a warm sentence blows it all into the air. So I gave him the money. Not right away, of course. I spent a week pretending to weigh the decision, while already knowing I would give him whatever he asked for. The sum was large enough to make my hands shake as I signed the transfer. Money saved over a lifetime of small sacrifices. Money I once imagined passing on to grandchildren who might someday sit on my lap and ask where I hid the cookies. $800,000. A number that feels shameful to pronounce now, heavy on the tongue, like a confession. But at the time, it felt like participation in something meaningful. It felt like proof that I had not lived my final years uselessly. It felt like love, or something close enough to fool me. I didn't notice when the small changes began, not at first. The way he stopped visiting without calling. The way my calls went to voicemail. The way his voice, when it finally emerged through the phone, carried the distracted cadence of someone speaking to an obligation. I wasn't prepared for how easily a son can become a stranger. I wasn't prepared for how quickly affection can turn into management. He told me I worried too much, that I didn't understand how charities worked, that I shouldn't stress at my age. He told me to let the professionals handle it. I didn't know those professionals existed only in his imagination. The morning of my birthday, I baked a lemon cake with shaky hands, smoothing the frosting the way I once smoothed his hair. I set the table with the blue china he always loved, the one cracked plate turned face down so no one would see the flaw. I wore a lavender blouse he once said looked elegant on me. I placed candles in the cake and rehearsed the smile I would give him when he walked in the door. Instead, the door opened to men with badges and steady voices, asking if Adam Hart lived here. And my son, my grown man with the expensive suit and the hollow eyes, was stepping backward, palms raised, as if the floor had tipped beneath him. He looked at me once quickly, searching my face for something, permission, help, denial, I don't know. But I stood still, hands on the table, feeling the old wood steady me in a way he never had. When they let him out, one agent paused beside me and said, softly, almost gently, "Ma'am, you did the right thing talking to us. But there is no right thing when it comes to choosing between your child and the truth. There is only the long quiet afterward, the trembling, the guilt that doesn't disappear but rearranges itself into something survivable." And now, when I think back to his words, "Mom, donate to my charity," I hear the emptiness in them. I hear the greed. I hear the distance. But I didn't hear it then. I only heard my boy asking for help, and I didn't yet understand that helping him would be the very thing that finally broke us. I didn't understand the truth until the day I stood in my bank's quiet office with my hands clasped so tightly the knuckles whitened, and a young woman with a polite smile explained to me, with the kind of careful tone reserved for the elderly or the fragile, that the charity I had given nearly everything to did not exist in any legitimate registry, nor in any known philanthropic network, nor even in the rough corners of emerging nonprofit databases. Her eyes flicked over the screen and then back to me, as if confirming whether I was aware of what she was about to tell me, and I remember the way my heart sank, not in a dramatic fall, but in a slow, methodical descent, the way a stone disappears into water, leaving only the faintest ripple behind. She asked if I wanted her to print the findings, and I shook my head, unable to speak, because in that moment I didn't want documents. I wanted time to reverse itself. I wanted to go back to the day he first sat across from me with that glossy brochure and the trembling mask of conviction. I wanted to catch his wrist, hold it tightly, and say, "Do not ask me for this, my love. You do not know the cost, but time is a merciless observer, and it lets mothers make mistakes quietly, without warning, until the truth stands in front of them like a cold blade." I remember walking home afterward, the city moving around me with its usual indifference, people carrying their coffees and backpacks and conversations as if the world were not, at that very moment, splintering under my feet. The sun was too bright for such a revelation, the air too warm, and a dog barked from the yard of a house I passed, as if mocking the idea that something monumental had shifted inside me. When I reached my front door, I stood there for a long moment, keys trembling in my hand, because I knew that crossing that threshold meant facing the truth without distraction, without motion, without the illusion that this was all a misunderstanding. I finally walked in, set my purse on the counter, and sat down at the table where I had once joyfully signed the transfer papers, believing I was participating in something noble. The house felt hollow, stripped of its usual gentleness, as if it too had learned something disappointing about the boy it once sheltered. The catalyst of a mother's heartbreak is never a single moment. It is an accumulation, a slow build, a series of small ruptures that finally converge. For me, it was the bank records, the receipts, the emails that led nowhere, the phone numbers that rang endlessly without reaching a real office or a real assistant. The realization that every document my son had shown me, the business registration, the certifications, the supposed partnerships, had been forged with a precision I hadn't known he possessed. He had always been clever, always persuasive, always able to smooth the rough edges of any situation with words, but I had not known that those gifts could be sharpened into weapons. I had not known he would point them at me. That night, when he called, I let the phone ring twice longer than usual before answering. I don't know why. Perhaps I wanted to hear the sound of it, to stretch those seconds into a space where denial could still breathe. When I finally picked up, his voice was bright, rushed, irritated in that subtle way he always became when he sensed I was about to be inconvenient. He asked if I had spoken to anyone, if everything was fine, if I was still with him on the project. The phrasing struck me, with him, as though he were leading an expedition, and I, his aging mother, were a volunteer dragging behind. I told him gently that I had been checking some of the paperwork. There was a small pause, hardly noticeable, but I felt it carve through the line. Then he laughed, too softly and too quickly, and said I shouldn't worry myself with details because the big picture is what matters. I listened to him talk, his words tumbling in a controlled cadence, and it felt as though I were hearing my son and a stranger speak in the same voice. Later, as I sat alone in the dim light of the kitchen, something inside me shifted, not snapped. Snapping implies drama, noise, the kind of clean break that does not match the truth. No, it was like a quiet turning, the subtle rotation of a key in a lock. I pulled out the brochure he had given me, the one with children smiling beneath bold, uplifting slogans. I examined it with the eyes of someone suddenly awake, noticing how the edges of the images didn't match the fonts, how the printed text held faint inconsistencies, how the mission statement felt more like a pitch than a purpose. I saw the lies, but what hurt more was remembering how easily those lies had felt like hope when he spoke them aloud. The next morning, I went through every folder I had saved of his so-called progress reports. I reread every message he had sent me about the campaign, the drives, the community impact. His tone was always warm, sometimes even tender, as if he were allowing me a privileged glimpse into something meaningful. But now the warmth felt recycled, prepackaged, the tenderness manipulated like a lever designed to move me toward compliance. I began tracing transactions, lining them against promises, building a map of where the money was supposed to go versus where it actually ended up. And with each discrepancy, each missing receipt, each misaligned date, I felt the quiet tearing inside me widen. When he finally arrived at my house a few days later, unannounced and strangely breathless, I understood that he already sensed the unraveling. He tried to charm me in the way he once charmed teachers or employers, leaning across the table, speaking in that practiced voice that carried both confidence and desperation. He told me he was close to securing a major partnership, that the charity would soon be featured in national media, that my contribution had been the missing link. Then he asked, casually, almost offhandedly, if I could transfer just a little more to cover a temporary operational shortfall. His eyes darted away as he said it. That was the moment the truth finally reached me, not as a revelation, but as recognition. He had not come to share good news. He had come because the well he had dug inside me was running dry, and he was thirsty. He wasn't building a charity. He was building a life raft for himself out of my savings, and he expected me to keep patching the holes without ever asking where they came from. I told him no, softly, firmly, almost kindly. His face shifted in a way that frightened me. Not anger, not disappointment, but something colder, a calculation settling behind the eyes of a man who had already prepared for this possibility. He told me I was confused, that I had misinterpreted everything, that stress was getting to me at my age. He said these things with the calm of someone who has practiced diminishing others until they forget the size of their own truth. After he left, I sat in the stillness of my living room, surrounded by the quiet weight of a betrayal that had taken shape and solidified. Mothers are told to forgive, to understand, to excuse. But what was forming inside me was not anger and not grief. It was clarity, the first clean breath after being underwater far too long. Something irreversible had happened, and the world would not go back to the way it was. I wish I could tell you that once the truth began to show itself, once the first thread of the lie loosened, everything collapsed quickly and cleanly, like a curtain dropping after a bad performance. But deceit rarely dies with drama. It prefers slow, quiet rot, the kind that spreads beneath the surface while the exterior still looks polished and intact. After I refused to give him more money, my son did what he had always done when met with limits. He softened his voice, adjusted his posture, and began treating me as if I were fragile, confused, vulnerable, anything except correct. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply recalibrated, shifting into a discomforting version of kindness that made me feel like a guest in my own judgment. He started speaking to me with long pauses between sentences, as if waiting for me to lose my train of thought. He slowed his explanations, repeated himself, and began calling me Mom, with exaggerated patience, the way a son speaks to a woman sliding into dementia. I remember one particular afternoon, the air humid and heavy, when he stopped by unannounced and sat across from me at the kitchen table. He placed his phone face down, a thing he never did, and smiled in a stiff, deliberate way. He asked how I was feeling, whether I had been sleeping, whether I felt scattered or overwhelmed, sprinkling the words like crumbs, leading toward a conclusion he wanted me to reach on my own. When I told him I was fine, his smile tightened as if my clarity was inconvenient. The escalation crept in quietly. He began redirecting conversations, steering them away from anything that resembled accountability. When I mentioned the bank or the missing receipts, he interrupted with stories about stress at work, or minor health concerns, or the baby needing more attention. He created a fog of irrelevant details, hoping I would lose the path back to the questions he didn't want me to ask. And because I have lived long enough to recognize avoidance dressed as narrative, I listened, not to his words, but to what was missing between them. It was in that silence, thick, deliberate, that I felt the distance between us widening. He started visiting less, but texting more, as if proximity made it harder for him to maintain control. Over the phone, he could shape the tone, choose the timing, retreat when necessary. In person, he risked the possibility of my eyes meeting his and revealing something he didn't want me to see. So most days, he kept his distance, crafting a version of himself that lived through brief, polished messages. Working late again, he'd write, or meeting with investors, or Long day. Call you tomorrow. The tomorrows rarely came. When they did, they carried the weight of an obligation, his voice slightly rehearsed, too calm to be genuine. I noticed how often he used business terminology now: miscommunications, delays in processing, unexpected restructuring, phrases designed to make ignorance feel like deference. Each time he spoke, he reshaped his story like clay, hoping I wouldn't notice the fingerprints left behind. I did not confront him. Not because I was afraid, but because confrontation requires belief that the other person is willing to meet you in truth, and I no longer believed he was capable of that. Instead, I observed. Observation is a quiet power older women often forget they have. When people stop seeing you as a threat, they stop guarding their secrets. And my son, in his growing confidence that he could manage me, began making small mistakes. He forwarded an email meant for someone else, a message filled with vague promises of returns to a potential donor. He left a voicemail in which he spoke too quickly, stumbling over details he had previously presented as certain. And once, when I asked how the children in his brochure were doing, he shifted his eyes downward in a way so sharp, so instinctive, that it sliced the final threads of my denial. The house began to feel different during those weeks. Objects I once found comfort in, the framed photograph of us at the beach, the ceramic bowl he painted at age 7, the quilt I sewed the year his father died, began to feel heavy, as if holding too much history to coexist peacefully with the present. I still dusted them, still arranged them with care, but every time I touched them, a part of me wondered whether the boy who gave me those memories still existed, or whether he had been swallowed whole by the man sitting in his place now. I tried replaying old conversations, searching for the moment where he began drifting into someone I no longer recognized. But memory is a treacherous editor. It softens sharp edges and dims harsh lights. What remained was only the ache of loss, not sudden but creeping, not loud but suffocating. He began mentioning his wife more often, even though she rarely called me. He said she was worried about my recent behavior, that I seemed anxious and paranoid, that perhaps I was reading too much into things. These comments were always delivered casually, as if he were relaying observations rather than planting them. When I asked to speak with her, he said she was busy with the baby, or visiting her mother, or overwhelmed with household responsibilities. It became clear that she was either complicit in the distance he was forcing between us, or a casualty of it. I wasn't sure which possibility hurt more. In the quiet escalation of emotional attrition, I noticed something else. He had begun to fear me, not me as a mother, but me as a witness. He steered conversations away from finances with the agility of a man guiding a blindfolded companion away from a cliff's edge. He stopped sitting too close. He avoided eye contact when I asked direct questions, and once, when I mentioned the word audit, his hand began to tremble ever so slightly, a barely visible vibration he disguised by adjusting his sleeve. It was then I understood that he knew exactly how precarious his situation was. And instead of stopping, instead of choosing honesty, he was trying to outrun the consequences by eroding my certainty, hoping I would crumble before the truth did. The escalation was not in the lies themselves, but in how carefully he wove them into the fabric of our relationship. He made me question my memory. He made me doubt my intuition. He made my intelligence feel like an aging mechanism, prone to error. He used gentleness as a leash, silence as a strategy, and guilt as currency. And slowly, steadily, the world between us changed shape. I began to feel like a shadow in his narrative, useful but inconvenient, present but dismissible, trusted only as long as I stayed quiet. One evening, after days of evasive messages, he came by again. He stood in my doorway with a container of soup from a restaurant far too expensive for his supposed salary, saying he thought I might not be cooking enough lately. It was such an oddly specific kindness that I recognized it immediately as a distraction. He placed the soup on the counter, glanced around the house as though checking for something out of place, and commented on how lonely it must be to spend so many evenings by myself. His eyes moved over the framed photographs, the bookshelves, the worn rug, cataloging my life with a distance that felt clinical. When I asked him how his charity was progressing, he replied with a long, winding story that said nothing, a speech meant to exhaust rather than inform. When he finally left, he hugged me quickly, his arms stiff, and I had the distinct sense that he was embracing me not out of affection, but out of obligation, a rehearsed gesture to maintain the illusion of closeness. After the door closed behind him, I stood there in the hallway, my hand resting on the wood, and felt an ache settle into my bones. It wasn't the ache of betrayal, not yet. It was the ache of recognition, the painful understanding that the distance between us was no longer accidental, but orchestrated, a slow, deliberate unspooling of the bond that once held us together. He wasn't just lying to me. He was managing me, reshaping me into someone easier to deceive, someone who would eventually give up asking questions altogether. I don't know the exact moment when the shift inside me began, but I remember the morning I sat at my kitchen table with the curtains half drawn and the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the room. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe without waiting for his explanations to arrive and tell me what to think. It was early, the kind of early that makes a house feel like a church, and I realized that in all my attempts to decipher his lies, I had forgotten to listen to my own sense of truth. I had spent too long letting him narrate the world for me, shaping my doubts, rearranging my fears, guiding me like someone too fragile to cross the street alone. And that morning, as I traced the rim of my coffee cup with a slow finger, it struck me that I didn't trust him anymore at all. Not his words, not his pauses, not his sudden bursts of tenderness. The realization didn't come with a dramatic swell of emotion. It came with a strange and unfamiliar calm, the kind of calm a woman feels when she finally stops telling herself stories about a man who has already let go of her hand. I decided, without saying it aloud, that I would no longer accept his version of events. Instead of calling him, I called the organizations he had claimed to partner with. Instead of believing his excuses, I searched databases myself, slowly, stubbornly, my glasses fogging as I leaned closer to the screen. I learned, and with every click, every document that contradicted his claims, something inside my chest straightened, like a spine long bent under someone else's weight. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt awake. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that the charity had never existed outside of his imagination and a handful of polished documents designed to fool people like me, people who trusted too much, who loved too easily, who believed that goodness could be taught by example alone. I found discrepancies in dates, contracts signed by board members who didn't exist, and photographs pulled from public archives rather than real events. And with every discovery, I felt the past rearranging itself, scenes from our recent conversations replaying in a different light, moments I once interpreted as stress or distraction now revealing themselves as calculation. One afternoon, after hours spent sorting through folders on my desk, I stepped outside for air. The sunlight was warm and indifferent, the birds chirping in gentle mockery of my unraveling illusions. I walked slowly down the block, my knees aching with the steady honesty of age, and it occurred to me that I had not taken a walk simply for myself in years. Every step I took seemed to push him further from the image of the boy I once knew, replacing him with the man he had become. And yet, beneath the layers of betrayal, a strange tenderness lingered, a reluctant acknowledgement that I was not mourning the man who deceived me, but the child I raised, the child who existed only in memory, preserved like a photograph I could know, longer matched to the face standing before me now. When I returned home, there was a voicemail waiting. His voice was tight, strangely upbeat, as if he could sense my distance through the ether. He talked quickly, filling the message with unnecessary details about work, the baby, the schedule he and his wife were juggling. Not once did he mention the charity, perhaps believing that silence would make the truth less visible. But the avoidance itself was an answer. I listened to the message twice, not for the content, but for the tremor beneath it, the tiny crack in the performance. For the first time, I recognized fear in his voice, not fear of losing me, but fear of losing control. I didn't call him back. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the slow movement of traffic, the trees bending in the late afternoon wind, the shadows lengthening across my yard. It was in that quiet, suspended hour that the shift deepened into something irreversible. I realized that the guilt he relied on, the guilt that had shaped my decisions for decades, no longer belonged to him. I had carried the weight of being a good mother all my life, bending myself into shapes that fit his needs, smoothing over his failures, forgiving his sharpness, filling the spaces he left empty. But sitting there in the stillness, with the truth spread out like scattered puzzle pieces on the table behind me, I understood that being a mother did not mean sacrificing my dignity to protect him from the consequences of his choices. Later that evening, I opened the drawer where I had kept all the papers related to the charity. Instead of feeling sorrow, I felt something steadier, resolve, quiet but firm. I placed the documents in order, cleaned the desk, and put fresh batteries in the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer, not because I needed light, but because I needed to feel in control of something small and tangible. The act was symbolic, a reclamation of order in a life that had begun to feel disordered by someone else's design. Just as I was closing the drawer, the phone rang again. I let it ring, and in the silence that followed, the house felt different. Not larger, not emptier, but more mine than it had been in years. That was the moment I understood that the shift wasn't about discovering his deceit. It was about rediscovering myself in the aftermath. I was no longer the woman who signed checks out of loyalty, nor the mother who accepted half-truths out of habit. I was a woman with clarity, and clarity, once found, doesn't leave quietly. That evening, as darkness gathered outside my windows, I lit a lamp and sat in the soft amber glow, feeling the weight of my own presence return to me. I realized, with a mixture of sadness and strength, that the path ahead would not be guided by his explanations anymore. It would be guided by the truth I had uncovered, the truth I could no longer unsee. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel afraid of it. I felt steadied by it, anchored by it, held upright by the simple, undeniable fact that I had finally begun to walk toward a life he could not manipulate or rewrite. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting or tears. It came with a breath, a decision, a quiet reclaiming of the space inside myself that I had unknowingly surrendered. It was not revenge and not rebellion. It was recognition. And recognition, when it finally arrives, is its own kind of freedom. I had thought that once the truth settled inside me, once I understood that my son's charity was nothing more than a carefully engineered illusion, the worst of the storm had already passed. I imagined that the collapse had happened silently inside his lies, that what remained for me was only the slow rebuilding of my own sense of certainty. But deception rarely ends in the moment it is exposed. It fights for survival, clinging to whatever remnants of control it can still reach. And so the weeks that followed did not deliver relief or closure. Instead, they brought a deeper, more insidious pressure, one that curled around the edges of my days like smoke finding its way into every breath, reminding me that a lie uncovered does not simply die. It retaliates. It began with the calls. Not constant, not frantic, but spaced carefully enough to seem concerned without revealing how badly he needed to manage my silence. He called in the mornings with an overly practiced warmth, asking what I had planned for the day, whether I needed groceries, whether I had remembered to take my medication, weaving threads of false tenderness between questions designed to gauge my intentions. When I answered briefly, refusing to be guided back into his familiar rhythm, he shifted into worry, telling me my voice sounded tired, that I was pushing myself too hard, that he and his wife were beginning to think I needed a little help with the administrative side of life. Every conversation felt like walking through a field of disguised traps, each sentence shaped to make me doubt what I had learned, what I had seen with my own eyes. I noticed that he no longer asked about the charity directly. Instead, he wove vague references into unrelated stories, as if the topic were fragile and needed to be treated delicately, or as if he believed that if he mentioned it frequently enough in passing, I might eventually forget what I had uncovered. He spoke of upcoming initiatives in tones too casual for seriousness, but too rehearsed for spontaneity. When I asked specific questions, the kind that demanded concrete answers, he laughed gently, like someone humoring an elderly woman who had misunderstood something obvious, and told me that I was overthinking matters that were under professional management. Then came the messages from his wife, not direct communication, but carefully curated fragments relayed through him, suggesting that she, too, was concerned about my state of mind. He said she felt I was becoming withdrawn, that I seemed mistrustful, that I was fixating on things that no longer needed attention. Her voice, even filtered through his, carried the faint edge of someone trying to avoid responsibility rather than share it. She had always been polite in a distant way, performing affection the way one performs a social courtesy, but now her absence itself became part of the manipulation. Whenever I asked to speak with her directly, he claimed she was breastfeeding, or bathing the baby, or lying down with a headache, crafting a barrier of domestic inconvenience that prevented any unfiltered conversation from taking place. And beneath those excuses, I sensed either complicity or fear. I still don't know which possibility weighs heavier on the heart. The pressure escalated quietly, the way a river rises without sound just before it floods. I started receiving mail addressed to both of us, brochures for retirement planning, pamphlets about assisted living facilities, invitations to seminars for aging adults preparing to transition control of their financial responsibilities. They arrived with increasing frequency, always presented by him as helpful suggestions, always accompanied by gentle comments about the importance of planning ahead, of not burdening family with last-minute decisions. I knew he was trying to guide me toward a narrative in which my own judgment seemed questionable, my independence a risk, my financial control something he could reasonably claim he needed to oversee. It was frightening, not because the strategy was aggressive, but because it was calm, smooth, nearly loving in its tone, like a hand guiding an elderly woman toward a chair she did not realize was meant to confine her. The day everything shifted further was a rainy Friday, the kind of steady, cold rain that makes the world feel heavy. I had spent the morning examining a stack of documents left from his last visit, and for the first time, I saw not just the inconsistencies, but the magnitude of what he had built. The charity wasn't a small deception. It was a sprawling invention, a web of fabricated partnerships, non-existent employees, and financial pathways that suggested a level of desperation I hadn't wanted to see. My hands trembled not from age, but from anger. And anger not at him, but at myself, for how far I had let things go, how long I had allowed the soft echo of motherhood to drown out the sharp edge of truth. He arrived unannounced that afternoon, soaked from the rain, smiling as though the sky were clear. He stepped inside, shaking off his jacket carelessly, glancing around the room with the sharp eyes of a man, checking whether his lies had stayed neatly arranged. He brought pastries from a bakery he knew I loved, placing them on the table with exaggerated care, the way one places an offering before a wary God. He sat across from me, folding his hands in that professional, prepared way of his, and began speaking about nothing of substance, weather, the baby, a television show I had never mentioned watching. When I asked him why he had come, the smile faltered just slightly, revealing the fear beneath its polish. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and told me he felt distance between us, that I seemed overly suspicious, that my recent behavior was worrying him and the family. The phrasing struck me, the family, as though he were separate from me now, an entity unto himself with alliances that no longer included the woman who had raised him. He said he thought it might be best if he handled my mail for a little while, or maybe helped with my taxes, or perhaps took on a more active role in managing my accounts, just until things stabilize. The implication was clear. He was trying to build a bridge between concern and control, hoping I would step onto it without looking down. When I didn't respond the way he expected, his tone changed, subtly at first, but perceptibly. He asked whether I had been talking to anyone, whether anyone had put ideas in my head, whether I had misunderstood something important. He was searching not for truth, but for leaks. His voice softened dangerously as he said he knew it was difficult for me to keep track of details now, that misunderstandings were natural at my age, that he was only trying to help. It was a masterful blend of affection and erosion, and for a brief moment, I saw the man he had become fully, without the haze of nostalgia or hope. Someone who believed that the easiest way to maintain a lie was to weaken the ground beneath the person who could expose it. In that moment, something inside me closed with a finality that surprised even me. Not my heart, but the door that had once made me accessible to his manipulation. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not my son, but a man drowning in his own desperation, pulling anything near him under in his panic. It did not excuse him. It barely softened him, but it clarified him. When he left that day, he hugged me again, but there was a stiffness in his arms, a calculation in the gesture. He held on just long enough to appear loving, but not long enough to feel it. As soon as the door closed behind him, I sensed the pressure shifting once more, tightening. I could almost feel his fear growing, mutating into something sharper. I stood in the hallway, listening to the rain against the windows, knowing that whatever came next would not be gentle. 2 days later, a letter arrived. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't warm. It was from a lawyer, not a threatening letter, not yet, but a carefully worded message expressing concern for my well-being, suggesting that my son had noticed recent declines in my cognitive stability and offering support in managing my estate. There was no accusation, no demand, only a quiet professional implication that I was losing my grip on reality and might need intervention. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it slowly, placed it on the table, and realized that the second escalation was no longer emotional. It had become legal, strategic, scripted with the precision of someone preparing for battle. And the heartbreaking truth was that the battle he was preparing for was against me. I had known for weeks that something decisive would come, some moment where all the quiet pressure he had been exerting finally met the immovable truth I carried inside me. But I didn't know it would arrive on a day as deceptively peaceful as my 79th birthday. The morning had begun gently, with soft light spilling through the blinds, and for the first time in a long while, I felt no urge to rehearse conversations in my head or anticipate the angles of manipulation my son might try. I baked a simple lemon cake, the same recipe his father loved, and I spread the frosting slowly, taking my time, letting the familiar motion steady me. There were no guests expected, no family gathered around a table, no grandchildren running through the house, just the soft hum of my life as it had become, quiet, contained, and unmistakably my own. It was within that stillness that I realized something had shifted permanently. I was not waiting for him anymore, not for his explanations or his approval or his guidance on how to navigate the fallout of his choices. The truth had become its own kind of oxygen, sharp but clean, and breathing it felt like the first honest act I had allowed myself in years. I set the table out of habit more than hope, placing the cake in the center and lighting a small candle, not for celebration, but for acknowledgement, a way of marking the fact that another year had passed and I was still here, still standing, still capable of choosing my own direction. I did not expect him to come, but I was not surprised when I heard a knock at the door, his familiar practiced pattern, 2 short, 1 long, echoing through the hallway. When I opened the door, he stood there in a pressed shirt and a forced smile, holding a bouquet of supermarket flowers that looked as tightly arranged as his expression. He stepped inside with the confidence of someone who believed he could still shape the atmosphere of a room, still guide my emotions the way he once guided our conversations. He kissed my cheek lightly, his lips barely touching my skin, and complimented the cake, as if commenting on its color might distract both of us from the widening chasm between us. We sat at the table, the candle flickering between us like a signal neither of us wanted to interpret. He spoke first, his voice unusually calm, almost rehearsed, telling me he wanted a reset, that the past weeks had been strained, that we had misunderstood each other in ways he didn't want to define. He said he wished we could return to simpler dynamics, a phrase that revealed more than he intended, because those simpler dynamics were the ones where he decided the narrative, and I followed silently, trusting his direction without question. His smile tightened when I didn't respond immediately, and I could see his patience thinning, the performance faltering just enough to show the tension beneath. He began asking whether I had reconsidered letting him help with my accounts, whether I had spoken to anyone outside the family, whether I had looked into unnecessary matters that only brought stress. His tone was soft but insistent, the same tone he used when he first asked for money, a tone that felt like silk but constricted like rope. I didn't answer his questions. Instead, I folded my hands on the table, and for the first time in years, I allowed silence to be my reply. Silence unsettled him. Silence created space he could not control, and I watched as he shifted in his seat, clearing his throat, adjusting his cuff, trying to fill the space between us with charm that no longer had a place in my home. And in that moment, as he leaned toward me with a new urgency in his eyes, I heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching against my driveway and the firm, deliberate footsteps of multiple people approaching my door. He heard it too, turning slightly, his expression sharpening into something like confusion, then irritation, then something deeper and more primal, fear. There was another knock, louder, more official, a knock that did not wait for permission but expected compliance. When I stood up to answer it, he reached out instinctively, his fingers grazing my wrist, and for a brief moment I saw the little boy he once was, scared of storms, reaching for the only person who ever made him feel safe. But that boy had grown into a man who built storms of his own, and I gently pulled my hand away before opening the door. The agents entered with calm professionalism, their badges glinting in the doorway light, their voices steady as they addressed him by his full name. They explained that they had questions, that there were investigations, that he needed to come with them. His face shifted from disbelief to indignation, to an almost pleading denial that looked like a shattered reflection of arrogance. He turned to me then, his eyes wide, searching for something he had always expected to find. My intervention, my defense, my instinct to protect him at any cost. But I stood still, my hands resting on the back of the kitchen chair, the candle flickering behind me, and I did not move. He said my name, not Mom, but my name, sharp and accusing, as though I had betrayed him by allowing the truth to walk through my door. He asked if I had talked to them, if I had given them information, if I had misunderstood things again. I didn't answer. I simply met his eyes with the calm that had grown inside me since the day I discovered the lies, a calm rooted not in vengeance, but in the simple fact that I had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. One of the agents gently asked me to step aside, and I did, my feet steady, my breath slow, my heart strangely still. As they placed the cuffs around his wrists, he turned his face away, not out of shame, but out of disbelief that I was not rushing forward to stop it. The man who believed he could control every narrative had finally encountered one he could not rewrite. When they guided him out of the house, the bouquet he had brought lay forgotten on the chair, the stems crushed slightly from where his hand had gripped them. The candle still burned in the center of the table, a small, stubborn flame that swayed gently in the draft as the door closed behind them. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the fading sound of the car pulling away, feeling the house settle back into its familiar silence. But now it was a silence that held no accusation, no fear, no waiting. It was simply quiet, the kind that fills a space once truth has finally spoken aloud. I walked back to the table and extinguished the candle with my fingertips, not in mourning, but in acknowledgement. The lies had collapsed not with a scream, but with calm inevitability, and though the sight of my son being led away would haunt some part of me forever, another part felt the faintest, gentlest release, like the loosening of a knot that had been tied for years. I sat down, sliced a piece of the cake I had baked with hands that no longer trembled, and ate it in the soft light of my kitchen, knowing that the moment I had feared most had arrived and passed, and I was still here, still whole, still capable of choosing truth over the illusion of motherhood he had tried to preserve on his terms. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like a woman undone by betrayal. I felt like a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows of someone else's narrative and into the quiet, unadorned honesty of her own. In the days after his arrest, the house felt strangely unburdened, as if some long-standing tension had finally drained from the walls, leaving behind not emptiness, but stillness, the kind that allows a woman to hear her own breath again. I woke that first morning and realized I had slept through the night, without drifting in and out of anxious thoughts, without imagining footsteps on the porch or rehearsing answers to questions he might ask in that soft, suffocating voice he used when he wanted to guide my thinking. The quiet had a different weight now, not the lonely hush of waiting for someone who would not come, but the peaceful hush of no longer needing to brace myself for whatever version of him would arrive at my door. I made tea slowly, letting the steam rise around my face, and for the first time in years I felt no need to rush anything, as though time itself had loosened its grip on me. Neighbors came by with cautious concern, offering sympathy in the gentle, uncertain way people often do when they are unsure whether they are entering a private wound or a private relief. I accepted their kindness, but kept my explanations simple. I did not recount the lies, or the money, or the letters from lawyers. I simply said that sometimes the truth finds its own way out, even when we spend years trying to protect someone from it. Their eyes softened in that way. People's eyes soften when they are unsure whether something tragic or liberating has occurred. And perhaps it was both in equal and complicated measure. I spent long afternoons sorting through drawers and closets, not to erase him from my life, but to reclaim the spaces he had subtly occupied, even when he wasn't here. I found in my kitchen with false smiles and careful manipulations. I did not destroy the photos. I placed them in a box lined with tissue paper, because love does not cease simply because trust has. But I did place the box on a high shelf, somewhere my eyes did not naturally fall, not out of rejection, but out of acceptance that the past belonged to a version of us that could not be recovered. There were moments, of course, when guilt tried to rise, moments when I wondered whether I should have waited, whether I should have confronted him more gently, whether a mother's role was to save her son even from himself. But each time those thoughts surfaced, I reminded myself that saving someone who does not want saving becomes another form of surrender, and I had surrendered enough over the years. My certainty, my instincts, my dignity, my silence. The truth is that he had crossed a threshold long before the agent stepped through my door. I only followed. One evening, I sat by the window watching the sun sink into the horizon, the sky shifting through shades of rose and gold like a slow exhale, and I realized that peace does not arrive suddenly or loudly. It arrives in small recognitions, that I can choose how to spend my days, that I can let the phone ring without fear of what guilt might be waiting on the other end, that I can stand in my kitchen without feeling observed by the ghost of decisions he wanted me to make. The house felt warmer somehow, not because anything had changed within its walls, but because I had changed within myself, occupying my own life again without apology. I wrote a letter that night, not to him. There was nothing to say to him now, but to a woman I imagined somewhere in another quiet house, a woman who might someday face the same unbearable choice between a love that demanded her silence and a truth that demanded her courage. I did not know her name or whether she even existed, but I wrote to her as if she had been sitting beside me all along. I told her that motherhood is not martyrdom, that loyalty without honesty becomes a slow form of disappearance, that we are allowed to choose ourselves even when the world insists our worth is measured only by how tightly we hold others together. I told her that letting the truth come forward is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of survival. And I ended with the only words that felt real, that she is stronger than she knows, and that strength sometimes looks like standing still while someone you love walks into the consequences they created. When I finished the letter, I folded it neatly and placed it in my drawer, not intending to send it, but needing it to exist. It was my offering to whatever tenderness remained in the world, a quiet assurance that women like me, older, dismissed, underestimated, are capable of an honesty that reshapes the very ground beneath our feet. The night settled around the house, soft and unthreatening, and as I turned off the lamp, I felt no fear of the dark, only the warmth of having finally stepped fully into my own light. And so the story ended not with triumph or mourning, but with a steady calm, the kind that comes when a woman finally understands that the truth does not take away her family. It merely reveals who in that family is willing to stand in the light with her